How's it going, everyone? Hope you're doing well today. We're going to be talking about everybody's favorite topic, divorce. And obviously that's just a joke. Everybody hates talking about divorce. It's uncomfortable, it's awkward, especially when you get into like the Old Testament and some of the laws concerning divorce. In Christian circles especially, divorce is kind of a taboo topic because it's just uncomfortable. Like, we know it's not what God intended, and so we are also still human. So we see people that get divorced, or we've got divorce in our own families, our own lives, and it's just awkward. It's weird. And then you get into the Old Testament, like I said, and you read these laws and people have different interpretations about them. And it's just a really awkward topic to talk about. Now today, we're not doing like some extensive survey over the whole topic of divorce. I just want to bring out one point that I found really interesting that actually, I believe, displays the mercy of God in kind of an incredible way, and I hope that's what you get out of it too. In Deuteronomy 24, starting in verse 1, we have this law regarding divorce, and I think it's very telling about something we see later about God. It says this in Deuteronomy 24, not 4, Deuteronomy 24 in verse 1. It says this: "When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance." So this is a law regarding the fact that if you divorce a woman and she goes and remarries somebody, you cannot, after that marriage is either over or the man dies, you cannot take her back. And most scholars agree this is a prohibition placed on the first husband, the man who issued her a certificate of divorce the first time. He cannot divorce his wife for any reason. Presumably this is something they would have picked up in ancient Egypt, where a man had a lot of power, and I'm not saying they didn't in ancient Israel, but a man had a lot of power and he could just like leave his wife for anything, or he could take multiple wives and just send some away and pick some up along the way. And so Israel is falling into this practice, and this is kind of a prohibition on that. And it sounds kind of rough because the woman is just like taken and then left and then wanted to be taken again. And you think, okay, well, how is this a good law? And it is tough. I mean, there are some laws in the Old Testament where you're just like, how is this good? Like, and I think that it really does have to do with the fact that, like in the New Testament, it says because of the hardness of their hearts, God allowed Moses to allow this thing. But there are rules, there are stipulations that were intended to be merciful and be kind. So God looks down on this people, Israel. He sees their sin and he says, man, you guys are so far gone that I have to even kind of moderate the sin that you are allowed to do, which you're not allowed to do any of it. I mean, people have this argument when it comes to like slavery in the Bible. Well, why didn't God just outlaw slavery? Yes, slavery is not right. It's not a good and moral thing. The people were doing it, and God said, if you're going to basically go your own way, there's going to be rules on this, because you are not going to treat other people as poorly as you have in the past, or as poorly as humans are wont to do. And so God kind of gives these stipulations to moderate a person's sinfulness, not because he approves of the sin, but because he's working with sinful people that are never going to be perfect. And so you can see throughout the Bible, I mean, look at the abolitionists. They look at slavery and they're like, clearly evil according to Scripture. But in the Old Testament, you look at these laws and you think, well, why didn't he just outlaw it entirely? It's like, well, his moral law is good and perfect and true. But when people don't follow that moral law, then what do? God has to put things in place to say, he could have just added no punishments to the law at all and said, well, I've told you it's wrong, and so you're just not going to do it anymore. That's not what happened. He said, when you do it, this is what's going to happen to you. And the same thing with things like slavery or divorce. He says, you're going to do it because you guys are awful. But when you do it, this is how you conduct yourselves so that it's the least bad, or the least consequences come to the innocent parties. And so God is bringing out mercy even amidst people's sinfulness. And so that's what we have here. It can be really tough to see it when you just read straight through the law of God, or the first 5 books. It can be kind of hard when you're getting into these like civil laws to say, well, where's the mercy of God in this? This just seems wrong. But when scholars go through this, they across the board pretty much agree that these are laws that are prohibitions against men who are just putting away wives for absolutely no reason. So here in this section, when you take that as the context into which this law is spoken, you've got people just getting rid of their wives. Then you have God saying, no, you cannot just get rid of her for nothing. You have to there's got to be some reason why this is happening. You cannot just do this frivolously. And when you do it frivolously, this is the consequence. You can't just change your mind back. You can't just one day say, yeah, I don't want you anymore, and then the next day have different feelings about it. You cannot do that. Something actually reprehensible has to be happening for you to give her a reason behind it. And there's also this certificate of divorce that you have to give her now. It's not just like by word of mouth this news gets out. You have to go through a legal system which allows for a time of reflection and possible repentance. And so you have to think about what you're doing before you do it. And when you do it, you cannot treat that as a light thing. You cannot just take her back because you just want her back. No, she is free to go and pursue a life. She can get remarried, and you don't get to just order her around or order her back to you. That's not how this works. So it's actually an elevation of the rights of women, even though it's really like on face value, it can be kind of hard to read that when you're not reading it in the context of just how depraved Israel was. And so this is kind of what's going on in this section on divorce. And it says that this is an abomination. And it's a protection for the woman. It's an abomination if the man were to go and just order her back to himself. It's like, no, you cannot just do this. That is a wrong thing. And so there's a protection here for the woman where she can't just be demanded to come back to a person that hated her at one point or saw her as awful and didn't want her around anymore, but now does. You could see all kinds of situations arising where maybe a man divorces a woman and then just gets kind of bitter and angry and brings her back just to treat her poorly. I mean, people are kind of sadistic, and God is implementing laws that stop that from happening. Now, you could also potentially see a sort of mercy for the man. I mean, imagine if he puts her away for a good reason. I mean, let's say she's been unfaithful, or like the Old Testament term is like she like whored herself, right? She's been unfaithful. She's gone around to other men. And so this man puts her away. You could potentially see a way in which a man puts her away, but then is alone and thinks, man, I miss her, or I want her back. And God's saying, no, we're cutting that off completely. That's not how this is going to work. You chose to leave her because it hurt you, and you're not going to let that happen again. We're drawing boundaries here, okay? We're not going wishy-washy back and forth. And so there's a protection for women in this, but I also believe there could be a protection for men as well. Now, that might be me reading into the text a little bit too much, but I do believe that whatever God does, he does it for the love of his people. And I think it's the tendency of us, I think it's people's tendency in the modern world that are against Christianity to read the Bible and point out the ways that they see that it clashes with their modern sensibilities of equality and fairness, especially towards women, right? But I believe that it can be the response of the church then to kind of dig into the word and say, no, this is how it's actually fair to women. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I believe that God also had in mind fairness to men. Fairness means fairness, not an elevation of one. Yes, if one is the oppressed, then there's an elevation of that one. But I believe that the law of God holds both as valuable, protection of men and women are valuable things in God's eyes. So I believe in this law and divorce, there is both the potential for the protection and elevation of women, but also the protection of men and the drawing of boundaries that are helpful for both parties. Now, what's interesting about this, especially in light of the fact that it is called an abomination. If this happens, if a man divorces his wife and then takes her back after she's been remarried, this is an abomination. It's not saying the woman is an abomination. It does say after she's been defiled, but again, in the context, when you look at all the words, the scholars are pretty unanimous on the fact that she is an abomination as far as the first husband goes. She is not an abomination unto herself. She is not some evil person just by virtue of being put away, but she is no longer a thing that is clean for the husband to partake of. He cannot remarry her, and then that's a clean thing. So as far as the husband's concerned, the act of taking her back is an abomination. And this is where we get into the mercy part. Okay, we've gone through the awkward Old Testament, let's dig into it part, but there is a really, I mean, we're still going to be in the Old Testament, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that, but we've gotten into the divorce part, right, that people don't normally like to talk about, but there's such an interesting thing with this in Jeremiah 3. Now, we know the story of Israel overall, right? They were betrothed to God. They made a covenant with God that was reflective of a marriage covenant. And they entered into this relationship with him. And constantly throughout the Old Testament, you see these moments of Israel's backsliding. This doesn't just mean that they sinned. Like, yes, they did sin, but they sinned all along the way. But these highlights of backsliding that God seems to point out all along the way of the Old Testament through the prophets is that they are committing idolatry, which is the same. It's kind of used in different terms. It's related to adultery because God is married to Israel and they are cheating on God with foreign gods. And so it's not just that he's their God, he's also the nation's husband. And so when they go after other gods, it's not just a committing of idolatry, it's also adultery. And we get this in Jeremiah 3, but we also get a really interesting pronouncement from God about what's going to happen because of this. Now, Israel is already taken captive. They have already been issued their certificate of divorce. We will see that in just a minute. And Judah is right on the brink. God is about to send them into exile. And Jeremiah writes this in Jeremiah 3:1, "If a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her?" So he's quoting this Deuteronomy 24 section. And he says, "Would not the land be greatly polluted? You have played the whore with many lovers, and would you return to me, declares the Lord." Now, what's interesting here is there are two ways to read this section. You'll notice at the end it says, "Would you return to me?" with the implication being, no, it's unclean. So even though you might want to return, you have committed adultery against me. You have cheated on me with these foreign gods. And so I've issued the certificate of divorce. You left. It's unlawful for me to bring you back. We cannot be in covenant again because the law prevents it. And so that's the implication when you read it like this. But there are other ways that this is translated, where it says, like in the New King James Version, they say if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's, may he return to her again. Would not that land be greatly polluted? But you have played the harlot with many lovers, yet return to me, says the Lord. So we've got two very different ways of reading this. One which says, obviously you can't come back to me because of the extent of what you've done. We have divorced, you've gone after other gods, you are an abomination to me now. I may not, according to the law, come back to you, and you may not come back to me. But then in this section it's saying, even though this is an abomination, yet return to me. Even though it's unlawful, even though it is against this ceremonial law that is how divorce is conducted, even though you have proven yourself to be unfaithful, and it might be a protection to me, the husband, to keep you at a distance and not bring you back, yet come back. And so which one is it? Which interpretation are we supposed to read? Now, I think either way you read it, you do get you do get the mercy of God either way, and we're going to get into that right now. But this is kind of an interesting thing. Like, how are we supposed to understand what God is saying here? Is he saying you can never come back to me? Or is he saying, yet, even though it's unlawful, let's put aside the law by virtue of the love that I have for you and come back to me, please? In verse 8 in Jeremiah 3, talking about Israel. It says, Israel played the whore, and I wrote her a certificate of divorce. I thought that Judah might look upon that and treat it seriously. It says, she saw that for all the adulteries of the faithless one Israel, I sent her away with a decree of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore. Because she took her whoredom lightly, she polluted the land, committing adultery with stone and tree. Yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, declares the Lord. And so both Israel and Judah have committed adultery with these foreign gods. And yet look at what God says next about faithless Israel. He says, the Lord said to me, faithless Israel has shown herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. Go and proclaim these words toward the north. Say, return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will not look on you in anger, for I am merciful, declares the Lord. So, even if in that earlier section, you want to say that, well, God was saying that she could never possibly return. Judah could never return to God because he issued her the certificate of divorce. She left him. She went after other gods, and now it is unlawful for her to come back. God is saying Israel did the same thing, and yet prophesy to Israel, return to me. And so here, even if you want to say he didn't say the same thing to Judah, he is saying that to Israel. He's saying, return to me, even though it's unlawful, even though I might get hurt. It's not right according to Deuteronomy 24, but I'm saying, come back to me. In Hosea 2:16, we have a verse that says, and in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my master. Or there's also kind of a play on words here. It says my Baal or my Baal. And so there's kind of a play on words where the Baal means Lord or master. It's also the name of a foreign god. And so God's kind of using a play on words to indicate that they'll no longer have the names of foreign gods on their lips, but also their relationship will change from one of master and servant to one of intimate husband-wife relationship between the nation of Israel and God. And so God is prophesying that in spite of Israel and Judah's backsliding, he wants them back. And even if through all of this you say, well, it doesn't make sense that God would just forego his law in order to bring them back. I mean, I would say that the love of God is much stronger than his law, even though the law of God is how his love is dictated. I see no problem with the law of God. But there are times, so people have this discussion all the time where they say things like, if you were hiding Jewish people in your basement during World War II, is that wrong to lie to the authorities? And some people say, yes, you shouldn't lie, it's against the law of God. And some people say, no, the law of God is all about loving your neighbor and loving God. And so it's more loving to protect the people that are in harm's way. And so we've had this age-old debate forever. I lean more towards, absolutely, I'm going to be lying to Nazis to protect defenseless Jews in my basement. Absolutely, I'm going to do that. And so here, God's kind of doing a similar thing where he's saying, yes, the law says once the divorce has been initiated, once you have left me, once you have whored after other gods, committed adultery, and attached yourself to these other people, other suitors, I can't take you back. And yet, my love for you is so great. Come back to me. I will take you back in spite of this. My love transcends that command. And so I think we have a great picture of beauty here, of mercy, but some people might still have a problem with it. To you, I would say this. Even if you want to say that, no, absolutely, God cannot go beyond his law for the sake of love, which I think is a wild interpretation to take, but even if you want to say that, then Jesus he institutes the new covenant, right? How does he do that? He does it through his death. And so Israel and God can once again be in covenant together because covenants last as long as the parties are alive. That's why you say, till death do us part. And so when Jesus Christ dies, he takes on the old covenant and says, okay, that is no longer in effect. I mean, it wasn't in effect all the way. Pretty much here, the old covenant, not the new covenant isn't instituted, but the relationship that God and Israel had is terminated in the sense that they're no longer betrothed to one another. There's a reconciliation period that has to happen. But when Jesus comes, he says, okay, we're going to completely get rid of that old covenant, and we're going to do it through my death. If it's till death do us part, rather than you dying, who's the offender, I will die on our behalf, and then I'll be raised to life again to institute a new covenant where we can lawfully be married. So you kind of have both things happening where, yes, God still follows down to the letter of the law because he allows Jesus Christ, or he causes himself, Jesus chooses to die on our behalf so that the old covenant is nullified and the new covenant can be instituted. But you also have God saying, I love you, and I'm going to forego this law to bring you back to me because my love transcends what you have done. And I just think that is such a beautiful thing. I mean, we sing songs about this, right? And some people have issues with it. There's that song by Corey Asbury called Reckless Love, and people have an issue with it because they think, well, God's love is not reckless. It's very measured. It's very logical, and it makes sense. But you look at a moment like this, and Israel would have read these verses not even knowing that Jesus Christ was coming, and they would have seen God doing an amazing thing. They see that God says, there's no way you can come back to me. There is no way, according to the law of Moses that he did to institute this measured divorce process that you guys are trying to abuse. There's no way you can come back. And yet God says, my love for you is so great that even though you've done this, even though it's contrary to the law, come back to me anyways. And I think that's absolutely beautiful.